So the 2022 season is finally over. I won't lie, it hasn't been the most interesting season, so I'm sort of glad to see the back of it. Obviously the season would have been a lot more interesting had Ferrari not made so many mistakes early on, but ultimately Red Bull were never not going to win it. This year was also the first one using the new set of technical regulations which were unveiled in 2019. So the question is, have they really worked? First of all, we need to establish what the goals of these regulations were, so we can decide if they've worked or not. So, let's do that. The first thing F1 set out to achieve was better looking cars. Now, of course, this is subjective and everyone will have their own opinion on it, but for me, I think the cars are overall better looking. The Red Bull looks great with the aggressive side pods and simple nose, as do Aston Martin and Alfa Romeo with their clean sweeping lines. There are a couple of exceptions like the Mercedes side pods which make it look like it's melting, and the Ferrari's nose which makes it look like an anteater, but these are only small things, and overall both the Ferrari and the Mercedes still look pretty good. Last year I thought most of the grid had good looking cars as well, the Mercedes and McLaren cars especially, but when we ignore the liveries, the Ferrari, Williams, Haas and Alfa Romeo cars all looked a little bit weird from the front. There's no denying that the 2021 cars looked aggressive though, and I think that's something the 2022 regulations kind of lacked at the start, but then again that's kind of to be expected when teams hadn't got to grips with them yet. And they look better now in my opinion. So, at least for me, the 2022 regulations have produced better looking cars, although none of them are better looking than the original renders F1 put out. I think the reason most of you clicked on this video was to hear about the racing, so let's talk about that, shall we? In the 2021 Bahrain Grand Prix, Verstappen was faster than Hamilton at the end of the race, but the car's inability to follow one another sort of meant he couldn't get past. It was great defending from Lewis, of course, but it was definitely helped by the fact that Max couldn't stay close enough around the corners. In the same race in 2022, it was Verstappen chasing Leclerc for the win, and he was able to get past pretty easily. But something different from what we were used to in 2021 was that Leclerc was able to repass him almost instantly. Ultimately, both Red Bulls had issues at the end of the race, and we were denied a proper battle for the win at the end. But Bahrain instantly showed us that these regulations make it easier to pass. Although Bahrain has always been an easy track to overtake at, so we can't draw any sort of major conclusion from it. Saudi Arabia was next, and I know a lot of people don't like it and say it doesn't make for good racing, but actually I think the positioning of the DRS zones makes it quite interesting. Last year it was Verstappen versus Hamilton for the win, and this year it was Verstappen versus Leclerc. To be honest, I didn't see much difference in the actual racing, but something I did notice was that DRS was a lot more powerful. And I know it makes for easier overtaking, but I don't think it's proper racing, and so this is definitely a downside of the new regulations. At some point we need to get rid of DRS, but a downside of the reduced dirty air these new regulations provide is that the power of the slipstream is also lower. So the easiest solution for this at the moment is to keep DRS, but just make it less powerful by making the gap in the rear wing smaller. Australia was the next race, and we don't have anything more recent than 2019 to compare it to, and to be honest, the racing wasn't great. Once again, the power of DRS kind of carried the racing, as did the safety cars. It definitely looked easier to follow though. Emilia-Romagna was our first taste of the cars in the wet, and we have a direct comparison with 2021's race here, with both being wet-dry races. I think the racing here was pretty good, but I still don't think it was as good as we were promised, and I'll explain why I think that is in a second. See, the next race was Miami, and I think this was the first time we saw a bad point of the new regulations. The track itself was new, so we can't compare it to anything, but what happened in the race was that Ferrari qualified ahead, but the Red Bull was such a good race car that they could convert a P3 qualifying to a fairly easy P1 finish. It would have been a much bigger margin of victory and a much more boring race if we hadn't had the safety car, but even after the restart, Max was able to disappear up the road again. The problem that this shows is that all Red Bull needed to do this season was make sure their car was the best in race conditions, and then even when Ferrari took pole, Red Bull could sail through in the race with pretty much zero difficulty, meaning we didn't really get that many battles at the front. Essentially what I'm saying here is that these regulations are doing their job a bit too well, because barring any exceptional circumstances like Leclerc's engine dying in Spain and Perez's pole in Monaco, the fastest car on the day always won. There were no surprise winners, whereas in 2021 we had Ocon taking a win in Hungary because Hamilton couldn't get through the field quickly enough. Had that race been run in this year's cars, Hamilton would have won that race all day long, but the difficulty to overtake almost made the race more interesting. Does that make sense? Another thing the 2022 regulations aim to solve is the large gaps between the top teams and the bottom ones, and I'm afraid this is something that hasn't really worked at all. The regulations were designed with very little scope to innovate in certain key areas, but all I think that's done is mean the teams with the brightest people behind the scenes have been able to exploit the few loopholes that are in the regulations and get a lot further ahead of the competition than if there was more room for interpretation. I mean, at certain tracks this year, Williams were over 4 seconds off the pace in qualifying, which is pretty bad. Now, Williams was sort of an exceptional circumstance this year, and they need their own full video at some point, but it should be mentioned that all the teams scored points this year, which is something that hasn't happened since 2019. So I guess you could argue that the new regulations have made it marginally closer, and next year we'll start to see the impact of the regulations that prevent top teams from having as much wind tunnel time. But something that was for some reason missed in the wind tunnel was porpoising, and although I'm sure a few people saw it coming, I think it overall slipped under the radar. To explain in fairly simple terms, porpoising is caused by the car being pushed towards the surface of the track by the downforce created by the floor and the bodywork, but at a certain point the car gets low enough that the floor enters something called an aerodynamic stall, meaning it produces significantly less downforce and therefore the car shoots back up again, thanks to the upward force from the suspension. When the car rises again, the floor can create downforce again, and so the car gets pulled back to the surface, and so the cycle continues. Some teams faced it worse than others, and the issue has mostly been corrected now, but even so, that first half of the season must have been tough on the drivers, and in a sport that values safety so much, a set of regulations that look to have been physically injuring the drivers is never a good thing. Plus, in high-speed corners, the porpoising could have been incredibly dangerous, as the car could suddenly have lost downforce mid-corner and potentially cause an incident like Verstappen's crash at Copse last year. So in that sense, they've not been great. I realise now that I've been really critical of the regulations in this video, and I don't mean to be, because they are clearly working. Yes, the front of the grid hasn't been the most interesting to watch this year, but the midfield has been amazing. Thanks to both the increased following ability and the closeness between the performance of the cars and drivers, I found the battle for fourth in the standings to be a lot better than it was last year. According to Pirelli, in the 22 races last year, there were 599 overtakes, and this year there were 785. Tracks like Monaco saw a huge improvement from just 1 overtake last year to 12 this year, but part of that was as a result of the 2022 race being held in the wet. I don't know if you remember the 2021 Mexican Grand Prix that well, as it wasn't a hugely interesting race, but towards the end it got a bit spicy as Hamilton was stuck in the dirty air of a lapped car, coming on the radio to say he couldn't get close. This allowed Perez to catch up to the back of him, but unfortunately Checo then faced the same problem, so he was forced to finish behind Hamilton when he arguably could have finished second. We didn't really have that problem at all in this year's Mexican Grand Prix, but sadly it was still a pretty dull race, as all the drivers were able to overtake each other, pull away, and finish in a fairly normal order, which a lot of people will argue is how it should be, but I still believe we need a bit of drama, and occasionally the success of these regulations means we get less drama, not more. What we need is something between last year and this year, something that means overtaking is still a challenge, but not impossible. Formula 1 has never just been about the drivers. If it weren't for the engineers, even the best drivers wouldn't have any wins. And if you, like me, want to work in F1, then I think I have the perfect tool for you. It's called Brilliant, and just as the name suggests, it's brilliant. You can get a 7-day free trial and 20% off an annual subscription to Brilliant by going to brilliant.org/JohnWarren, and let me tell you why it's worth it. Brilliant is the best way to learn STEM subjects interactively wherever you go. For all you wannabe F1 engineers, the Classical Mechanics course gently builds you up with its 49 short interactive lessons, of which several are specifically focused on Formula 1. Without the basic knowledge from this course, I wouldn't have been able to speak so comfortably about Formula 1 in my personal statement when I applied to study aeronautics at Southampton, and so I probably wouldn't have been given a place. I use Brilliant every day as a way to build on what I learn in school. Right now we're learning about astrophysics in my physics class, so I'm working my way through Brilliant's course on the subject as a way to expand on what I'm learning. But you don't have to still be in school to benefit from what it has to offer. There's new content being added monthly on relevant topics like cryptocurrencies, solar power, and artificial intelligence. As well as that, I use Brilliant's daily challenges to keep myself sharp on subjects I might not be learning in the courses I'm doing. These are completely free, and I'd encourage you to try one out after this video. So, whether or not you're still in education, I honestly believe Brilliant has something great to offer. To get 20% off an annual subscription, then just use my link, brilliant.org/JohnWarren. Thanks to Brilliant for sponsoring this video, and thank you for supporting the people who support me.